In this lecture, we are going to be talking about advice and supportive interactions. We're beginning to talk about some specific interpersonal relationships in Chapter 10, and advice is really important in a lot of relationships, most of the relationships that we'll talk about, but they're really important in friendship relationships, which is really where we are centering kind of our discussions this week. Your article that was assigned really talked about kind of advice in general, but also what makes some advice better than other advice. And so the article really looked at defining what is good advice. So thinking about recommendation or advice in general, advice is recommendations about what might be thought, said, or done to manage some sort of problem. So you can think about, when your friends come to you with some sort of issue, maybe it's a different interpersonal issue, maybe it's an academic issue, some sort of problem that they have, you often are called upon to provide some sort of recommendations things that they should do, how they should think about the problem, to help remedy that issue. And so the article really talks about what are some characteristics that make some advice better than other pieces of advice. So we know that advice is perceived positively by the recipients. It facilitates the person's ability to kind of cope with or fix or manage the problem. And it is advice or recommendations that are able to be implemented by the person who's receiving the advice. And so these are things that we're really going to talk about today as we really break down some of the categories that that determine how we evaluate advice. We know that advice is a common communication process in relationships, but we also know that it can have some benefits as well as some drawbacks. When we think about advice in friendships, we know that for the people who are receiving the advice, they can often obtain useful information or insight or motivation on how to manage a problem. This type of support, so advice is a kind of support that we give in relationships, can promote a reduction in stress or upset that can be caused by the problems that we experience in our lives. And the advice can be kind of like a showing of concern in a relationship and caring, thinking about kind of emotional support that we've talked about, our emotional commitment that we've talked about before. In this way, advice can enhance the relationship, right? So when we get good advice, we think that somebody, has our best interests at heart. It can make the relationship stronger. However, we do know that sometimes advice isn't always good. We can get bad advice. We can get unsolicited advice. Sometimes when we're called on to give advice, we aren't necessarily sure what to say. And so sometimes giving advice can exasperate our own stress or upset. If advice is unsolicited or unwanted by someone, it can sometimes be perceived as undermining someone's independence or autonomy, which can have a negative impact on the relationship. So sometimes when advice isn't evaluated properly or appropriately, or it's unwanted, it can actually put strain on the relationship. So that's really why we need to think about what makes some advice good, or how do we give good advice to others? Like, what kinds of things do we need to think about? As we think about this, before I go into some of the criteria of what makes some advice better than others, I want you to think about your own recent interactions. One where you were given advice in an interpersonal relationship. I want you to think and share through Play Pause It. Who was the advice giver? What was the context that the advice occurred? What was the content of the advice? What did the person tell you to do? And how did you evaluate that? Did you evaluate that advice as being good advice or bad advice, and why? So go ahead and take a moment to reflect on this now. So your reading for advice really talked about in the majority reading some criteria that we use to evaluate advice. First, we really look at the contextual appropriateness of the advice, thinking about the need for the advice, the desire for the advice, and where the advice comes in the sequencing of our interactions. So first, looking at the need for advice to be evaluated more favorably, we expect that the advice is most relevant to, or advice is most better perceived for controllable problems. Controllable problems are problems in which there is a way in which we can alter kind of the outcome. As we think about some of the issues related around the pandemic right now, that isn't necessarily a controllable problem. There's not much we can do to change what's going on in our environment. But in our relationships, there are situations where we can have make changes. So if you think about even something as silly as doing, or, something not necessarily relationship specific, but I've used this example before, kind of your performance in a class, right? We can think about how you can change your behavior sometimes to alter that situation. And so some people may evaluate that as a controllable problem. And so as we think about our need for advice, we're really thinking about, okay, looking at the problem and thinking about, is there a way in which we can alter the situation reasonably within our control to change the outcome? And if the answer to that is no, then advice is not going to be effective in that interaction. And because it's not, or the person doesn't have control over the situation, then they are going to probably evaluate that advice more poorly because there's nothing that they can do. When we are giving advice, we also, kind of related to controllability of the problem, we need to think about what has the person already done to solve or remedy this issue that they're experiencing. And so this is really where question asking comes in and is really important. Jumping down a little bit to interactional sequencing of advice. Before you give advice, it's often important to gather information through asking the person's questions. And one of the things that you should ask them is, well, what have you already done? Like, what have you tried? Tell me a little bit more about, how you responded, so you can better assess kind of their need for advice, right? Because if they've already implemented all the strategies that they have within their kind of their ability, or done the things that you may have already advised, then there is no need for your advice, right? So in those cases, if there is no need for advice, then there are other forms of support that may be more important, or kind of better for that situation. Similarly, we need to think about the desire for advice. And here's really where we get into unsolicited advice. In relationships, you may have experienced this, right, where you were experiencing a problem and you just wanted somebody to, you kind of commiserate with, and they come in and they tell you all the things that you should have done, right? And you're like, I didn't really need to hear that. I just wanted somebody to tell me that this situation sucks and it's going to be okay. In that case, you have this unsolicited advice. And oftentimes, when you get advice when you don't really want it or you don't ask for it, it is evaluated more negatively. It can be viewed as intrusive and unsupportive in relationships. And so when we think about giving advice, oftentimes it's important to wait until the person who's experiencing the problem asks, what do you think I should do? What are your thoughts? How do you think I should respond, right? All of those comments, sentences really initiate and invite the person's kind of recommendations. If you aren't invited to give recommendations, then you really should not do so, because that would be unsolicited advice. There is no desire for the person experiencing the problem to get advice, and whatever you say, if you give advice as a form of support, it's going to be viewed negatively. It could have harmful effects for your relationship. So going back to the interactional sequence of advice, advice is best received after some sort of emotional support is already given. And so when we think about, you might say something like, God, this really sucks, I'm really sorry, as well as, efforts for information gathering have been accomplished. So that's the second kind of thing in terms of interactional sequencing that's really important. Ask questions to help get information, to better tailor your recommendations, as well as to help encourage the recipients to kind of discuss the problem and think about how they're perceiving it, and that might help them come to some sort of conclusions on their own as well. So contextual appropriateness for advice is really important. We also, when we're evaluating advice, think about the source of who's providing the advice. And there's three things: expertise, confidence, and closeness, that are really important when people are evaluating the source of advice. When we first think about expertise, advice is more positively evaluated if the receiver of the advice perceives that the person giving the advice is an expert. And we can think about expertise in a lot of different ways. You might think about your parents as being experts at kind of wise because they've been through more of life than you have. So when I think about, my husband and I, a couple years ago, we bought our first house. My dad is a general, electrician. So, whenever I have kind of a household problem, especially related to, maybe, installing a fixture or things of that nature, I go to my dad because he's an expert, right? He's has a lot of knowledge about kind of home improvement, but he's also maintained kind of the home that I grew up in, and so he has a lot of expertise in that area. We can also think about, perhaps, expertise in terms of somebody's education or their age, life experience. So expertise is really important, and oftentimes we go to people for advice in a certain kind of topic or area because we know that they have some sort of experience or knowledge or expertise in that area. We also want advice givers to be confident in their advice, right? So we're going to evaluate advice depending on how confident we feel that the person is in their recommendations. So if you say, I have a friend who did this and it worked really well, and I've done it myself and it's great, then that recommendation is going to have more confidence, and it's like, well, I'm not sure if this is going to work. It's something you could try. It's had mixed effects in things that other people have used it. I'm not certain about this recommendation. That's going to be perceived as having less confidence, and so we evaluate advice givers and advice that is given with more confidence and more favorably. We also, in terms of source of advice, look at and consider the closeness, our level of closeness with that person. So people evaluate advice more favorably from people who they are more close with. So if you have a relationship with somebody and you're asking them for advice, or sometimes even if we have a close relationship with somebody, we forgive some of the kind of faux pas of advice giving, like receiving unsolicited advice. We might not evaluate unsolicited advice as negatively if it's coming from a close friend as opposed to if it's coming from an acquaintance or a stranger, right? And so the source of advice is really important, especially as we think about the level of closeness that we have with that person. Another criteria that we evaluate in terms of advice is the style of the advice. So, how is the advice given? We can also think about this sometimes in terms of the tone of the advice. We want to give advice in a way that does not threaten the other person's autonomy. So the language or style in which advice is given is important, especially as it concerns how kind of the implications that our advice has for the other person's kind of level of competence for them to solve this problem on their own, or the autonomy for them to solve this problem on their own. So thinking about competence as well is really important. We want to give advice in a way that uses language in such a way and focuses on paralanguage. So nonverbal paralanguage is really important here as well. That advice that does not threaten the other person's autonomy, and it does not threaten their competence to solve the issue kind of on their own without your help. This is related to the content of the advice as well. So we want to make sure that advice is useful, that it's comprehensible and relevant to the problem. We want to make sure that it's efficacious, or that the other person has the kind of efficacy or the belief that they have the ability to address the problem, so that the recommendations that you have are likely to be effective at addressing the issue. We also want to make sure that the advice is feasible. sustainable so that the person is able to accomplish the task that you are recommending. That it's free of too many limitations so that there's not a lot of challenges or barriers that the person may experience in trying to accomplish your recommendations, and that it's free of any kind of potentially negative drawbacks or consequences. So taking these things into account, your chapter, the reading for on advice, really ended with 5 things that when giving advice, so when we think about kind of evaluating advice, we're looking at it from the receiver's perspective, but the ending of the reading really talked about, okay, well, flipping that on its head a little bit, what are some recommendations that we can make to people who are giving advice to others? And so really thinking about that in terms of advice for the advice giver. So the first piece of advice is not to assume that every person who has a problem needs or wants advice. So this goes back to kind of that desire for advice as well as need for advice here. In some situations, maybe if we think about like the death of a loved one, there's nothing that can be done to solve kind of the grief that they're experiencing. So we really need to think about, is that situation, is advice the best form of support? Well, probably not. And so we can think about other ways to provide support to that person. Sometimes even when there is a solution, maybe the person isn't ready to hear it. Maybe they're still really upset about the problem. Maybe their emotions are clouding their judgment. And so in those cases, it can be best to wait to give your advice until they've calmed down, or maybe until they've asked you again for advice. They've shown that desire for advice. Thinking about number 2, hold back on giving advice if you are not a well-qualified source. So really thinking about those source characteristics. Do you have any kind of real expertise in that area? How confident are you in the problem that they're experiencing and the recommendations that you may make? How close are you with this person? Is it appropriate, even based on your level of closeness, for you to give them advice in the area that they're experiencing a problem? So we know that advice can be poorly received if the recipient does not see you fit in terms of your confidence and your expertise for giving advice on the problem that they are experiencing. We want to make sure that we think carefully about the actions that we're going to advise, trying as much as possible to consider why you think that action is a good one, but also how the other person's going to view it. So thinking really about kind of perspective taking, thinking back on that perception chapter, like how is this person going to take what you're saying as well as how you're saying it. And so again, asking questions to get their point of view is a great strategy to help accomplish number 3 here. Thinking about the style at which we give advice. It's important to exercise sensitivity in how you're phrasing your advice, the language that you're using, the tone at which you're giving your advice. So here, this is really just saying like how you say things matter. And is, some of us fall behind this cloud of like, I was just being completely honest. I want to be direct with you, right? We hear these phrases a lot, but that's not always appropriate for the situation or the relationship in which we're giving advice. And so it's important to remember to really use tact and sensitivity when giving advice to others, especially thinking about, kind of their emotional state and the problem, this, kind of specific problem at which you are advising on. And finally, we need to remember that advice is a powerful force and it can be used for good or bad. And so we need to make sure that we are using the best moral judgment when providing advice for others. Most people expect advice in their close relationships, and so it's almost inevitable that you're going to be called on to give advice at some point. And it's important to think, about your recommendations and making sure that you're using the information that you received in, the article that you read for this lecture to give advice that's going to be evaluated positively and recommendations that are going to be best for that person and not necessarily best for you or somebody else. So that concludes the topic on advice. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the reading for Advice and Friendships.